Datjaeda. I'm with Lawndale Christian Health Center. I've been with Lawndale for 5 years, and as their HR director, I'm honored and maybe privileged to be able to sit in the rooms with a lot of employees going through a lot of challenges, good and bad in the other. And one of the things that I have the expectation to do is to do the separations. And I've been in HR for 10 years, right? I've been doing HR management. Well, I've been in HR for 12 years. 2 of those years I was a recruiter. And the last 10 years I've been as a director. And I'll tell you, there's never been an easy thing when it comes to doing a separation, right? It's not an easy job. It's not an easy experience, but it's part of the core work that we do when we're doing people work, people relations, right? And so today I thought about why is this topic important? When we're doing a separation, especially as Christians, as believers, we want to do something that is dignified for the person that we're sharing that moment with. And some people would say, is dignity present when you're taking away the livelihood of an individual? Maybe, but how can we make that present? So the purpose of this training is to identify how we can execute involuntary separations. And if you were with me last year, I presented on Christ-centered crucial conversations. And so we're going to utilize some of that principle as we engage in that conversation. There's 2 types of separations that we have. There is the voluntary separations. Those are the moments when an employee is resigning, a contract's ending, or we are doing, a retirement. Those are things we want to celebrate. People are growing and going on to other phases of their life. And then there's the involuntary separation, and that's when the organization has made the decision to part ways. And I say separate. I use that word separate with that employee. You know, when we think about what does dignity mean in that moment, I like to think about what God says. In the Bible, the principle of dignity in that context is that inherent worth and honor bestowed upon human beings by virtue of being created in the image of God. What does that mean to you? That means we're all created in that same image. Just because I'm on this side or you're on that side, it has no difference in the worth that each of us maintain. And so that's why it's important for us to think about those individuals that we're having those conversations, seeing them in their inherent worth according to Christ's principles. I want you to do some reflecting, and we can utilize this reflection and maybe go back to it when we do our case review and discussion. Think about a time when you have had to either leave a job yourself or you've watched someone leave a job. What was that experience like? Was it a good experience? Was it a bad experience? What was one word that you can use to maybe reflect and describe that experience? Would one of you share with me? What is one word that you would use if you've reflected on a separation that maybe you've had or you've seen someone? Give me one word, Ricardo. One word, Ricardo. What was that experience like in one word? Cold? Professional? So the context of the language that you all are using is really steeped in one thing that I would say is that emotional context, right? It's an emotional moment. It's an emotional experience. And so when you're reflecting on those moments, I want you to sit a little bit in your human space. Again, for this context, Christ-centered crucial conversation, something I shared with CCHF last year. There's a few principles that were guiding principles for me, and I hope can be guiding principles for you as you're thinking about those circumstances, maybe preparing to go into a moment of doing a separation. And those 4 principles are awareness of your emotions, right? How are you feeling about this moment, this discussion, this experience, what you have to do? What's happening around you and in the context of the workplace and the context of just the workforce in general? What's the perspective that you're experiencing that is making you make this decision, that's driving you to this place? is what's the facts that are coming with your desire to move into a separation discussion? Love and curiosity. And love and curiosity is a key piece when we're talking about difficult conversation, because curiosity has a lot to do with asking questions. And now I'm not encouraging you, and we'll talk about this later, to ask questions when you're doing the separation. Those questions should be asked long before that conversation is had, right? And then joint resolution. That resolution means, so we don't want to make that decision in isolation, right? We want to make sure that we're consulting those who might be in the chain of command, consulting those who might be in the workspace experience and might be affected by that separation that you are preparing for. So those guiding principles, I want you to think about those as you're anticipating what you might have to do when it comes to doing an employment decision. So let's go back large picture, right? I think a lot about the workforce. I think a lot about what's happening, especially now, what's going on post-pandemic, right? So in 2019, Gallup surveys were talking about employee engagement. And in 2019, they said 60% of remote capable employees, that's not frontline necessarily folks who have to be in places that can't do their work remote, but remote capable employees spent their week working fully on site in 2019. And that percentage dropped drastically by 2023. I think that's a significant shift in how people worked, right? The other factor that Gallup talks about is how employees are managed has about 4 times as much influence on an employee's engagement and well-being as their work location. So what does that say? So it's not necessarily that they're working remote or working in site. It's really about how they are managed that impacts that engagement. Curious, right? The relationship between the manager. And then the other piece that I thought was curious is employee engagement in the U.S. fell to its lowest level in a decade in 2024, with only 31% of employees reflecting engaged. So if you think about the context of the greater sphere of the workforce, folks are feeling less connected, less part of the workforce in the ways in which we probably like them to feel, and more dissatisfied with the ways in which they are managed as they work. So let's drill down just a little bit more, thinking about community health workforce engagement. Community health workers report being more engaged in their work because it's tied to the mission. No surprise, right? So if I feel connected to what I'm doing, I feel more engaged in doing it. However, they still have challenges similar to any other general worker, which are, in this context, lack of management support. I think those of us who work in community health know the challenges of having consistent management, the burnout, because we are so mission driven often, right? We're stretching ourselves thin to do all the things that we know we would love to do. And then that job stability. And I think about a lot of times we are funded by grants and dollars that come in, and in the space that we're in now again, right? Some of those dollars are not guaranteed. And so that job stability or instability can be destabilizing for community health workforces. And then I think a little bit even deeper about what we are. We're faith-based workforces. And the Best Christian Workplace Institute, I love that we actually were able to grab some information and some data about faith-based workforces. And their survey that was on faith-based work culture, revealing that leadership, quality, team, unity, and spiritual support are key engagement factors. That shouldn't be a surprise, but the challenges also aren't a surprise. They're similar to the same challenges that non-faith-based organizations have, from burnout. But the other piece, limited workforce resources. And what I think is curious is that work clarity, right? It's like the church all over again in the workforce. Our work is always just very fluid. We're doing the things that we feel called to do. Oftentimes, the message, the mission is changing, and the people are just in need, and we are responding to that. that can burn anybody out. So all that context comes into purview when we're thinking about what's happening with our employees. And then we think about the other shifts that are happening, right? Generational shifts. We talk about the 5 generations in the workforce. Man, those conversations are heavy. And then we're talking about not only the conversations of how do we do it, what do we do, what's valuable, what's not valuable. And each generation has their own perspective, take, and desire that sometimes just doesn't align. We have challenges in the wage versus cost of living challenges, right? Everything keeps going up. The eggs are so expensive. I can't even eat eggs anymore. And my dollars aren't coming in the way they used to. Taxes are high. So there's those things that are pulling on people, that are pulling on employees, that are pulling on all of us in so many different ways. And not to mention AI. Oh, the beautiful world of AI. What is happening there? Now AI can do what? They can write your emails. They can, create your PowerPoints. They can help you have a conversation that you never would have had AI not been accessible to you. So there's some things in which that are shifting the way that we work. All of that comes into context when we're talking about that employee's struggle. So I wanted to give you that grand picture that you might be experiencing yourself at your clinic and what you might want to be thinking about and how to address it. But here's the thing. The point of our meeting today, our workshop today, is to talk about we know that we've got to make some employee decisions. How many of you are managers here? Yeah. Tell me how many of you have had to terminate. Yeah. Sometimes when you know it's not working, it takes time to get there. But if you look through, so some of the things that I like to think about is not only are we thinking about what's happening in our organization, what's happening with that employee. Have we done that work, right? We've done the coaching, we've done the disciplinary actions, we've done the performance improvement stuff, and sometimes we're saying, hey, this person is just not keeping up with what we need. Our clinics are constantly changing expectations. So, I think about what providers are experiencing in the clinic room, right? And now you need to collect this piece of information. Now you need to collect that piece of information. Now you need to be more present. Now you need to report this. Now you need to report that. And some folks who have been working in these spaces for so long, doing that extra thing is just not part of something that they feel comfortable, confident, or capable to be able to do. But then sometimes we have not done as great of a job as we could do in our recruitment and our hiring. And, we've experienced that. You think the interview just went so great. Man, they were just awesome. They knew all the things that we've asked. They answered every single question and we hired them and they turned up and they were somebody else. And you're wondering what happened between last week and now here you are. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes we have had people working for us and they have these skill gaps where we believe that they were capable and able and we know that they're just not. But we still got to get our work done, right? Sometimes, and this happens often in our faith spaces, correct? Where we believe that they understood the mission and then they got there and their mission understanding and alignment was not quite where it needed to be. And truly enough, especially now, some organizations are going to be going through some restructures. When dollars are not present, particular programs and projects that we were so passionate about no longer have the funding. We have to think about how do we approach this work in a different way. Restructuring is part of that conversation. But before we get to that decision, one of the things that I really try to do with our managers, with our leadership, is ask all the questions, right? That curiosity, asking the questions, exhausting every single option, because it might seem like try to mitigate the issues that you're experiencing and wanting to separate because of. Sometimes it turns out in our favor and they're like, you know what? I didn't do that. You know what? You're right. And it turns it around. Praise God. Sometimes they've done everything They've done all that they can and they are burnt out. And I don't ever want our managers, our leaders, or anybody working in a situation where they're feeling so locked into a circumstance where they cannot get out of, right? And so we move forward. So the next piece is to think about, okay, if we're going to go forward with a separation, let's walk through what that looks like. And so this is something I'll do with my own, just kind of going through my own caseloads and reviewing, okay, what did we do before? How did we do this? And making sure that we're complying with the legal requirements. You know, we're all from different states. There's so many different laws and employment regulations that we have to abide by. So I really encourage you, if you are entering into that discussion, to pay attention to the laws that are in your area. I put up a few for you to kind of take a look at and dig a little deeper, being on the termination that you're going to engage in. The Warren Act, which is something, and when we're doing large layoffs, that you want to make sure that you're giving those 60-day notices. You can probably reflect in the news that the way that Doge probably did it didn't quite align, and accordingly, so you want to be mindful of how you approach large layoffs. State-specific separation. Some states have particular notices that you have to give employees when that separation is presented to them. So you want to just be real careful. Some say you have to give them at least 20 days to make a decision to think about a separation if it was one of a restructure, not a involuntary or a egregious act. Some states are at-will states, right? I work in Illinois, right? So we're an at-will state. At-will states versus contractual employment terminations. Even if you're an at-will, you have to look at that contract to make sure that you have abided by that separation clause that is listed, okay? You can't just end that relationship and go about your business. Anti-discrimination laws, of course. This can be a really sticky place for managers. They may feel that the termination requirement is safe, is clear, is reasonable, but some things that can catch a manager is if that employee has recently filed a harassment grievance, they've filed discrimination grievances, sexual harassment, or even this one where they have been denied a protected leave, an FMLA leave, a personal leave that is protected by the state laws, and you terminate them out of that. So those types of things, you have to be very careful when you're going to make that decision for separation. I put the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act in there because our workforce is shifting. So if you are considering a termination at a large scale, especially, you want to make sure that you look at the age range of the employees that you're going to separate so you can provide, there's a particular clause that you will add into their separation letter to ensure that you're not violating their rights. There's so much legal. So I am not a lawyer and I'm not going to give you legal advice. I encourage you to call a lawyer if you don't have one, if you do not have legal counsel. Reach out to your CEO, CFO, HRD, and they could probably connect you to some of the questions or get the answers to the questions that you have when you're thinking about this. But you're not going to be doing this alone. At least I pray you're not. Again, we want to have collaborative discussions before we move to make such a grave decision. We're impacting somebody's livelihood. We could be setting them on a path of something that they are unprepared for. And so all of this work has to go into making that decision before we get to the end, right? Thus, I think about crucial conversations. Crucial conversations, if you've ever read just kind of the general metrics of crucial conversations, the piece in there that I like, and I use that in my Christ-centered crucial conversations, is starting with that heart, right? Thinking about where do you sit? What's happening with you? Are you mad? You're like, I'm firing her. She's on my nerves and I want her gone. Be mindful of how, I still look like that. She need to go. Be mindful of where you're at. Because you don't, just like any decision you make in your life, you don't want to do that in an emotional state. Pull yourself out, look at the facts, think through the process, make sure that you're being very clear and unmoved by those emotions and those pieces that can really send us into a place of discrimination. There's always something that can be driving us to decide to do a separation. And sometimes there are those invisible biases that we all have inside, right? Sometimes we're just saying, she doesn't fit in. What does fit in mean? Oh, she wears her hair up or down. She likes a lot of makeup, or she don't wear any makeup. What does that fit mean? Really think about why you feel like that person is not a good employee that can continue on with your organization before you just jump forward. And I know all of you good managers are trying to do that well. Thus, you're in this class. So I want to go back to this case review. I want us to walk through how we execute. We get to that moment. And as you're thinking about your own case, because I suspect some of you have something in mind that you're going through, I want you to think about, how do we execute that piece? One of the things that I think about when I'm talking about dignity, the Bible really reminds us that we're all human, we're all flawed, we're all broken in a sense. And I like this scripture from Job, and he was lamenting about the pain, right? He's lamenting about the challenges. Do not mortals have hard service? This person could have been tired, said, I just can't keep up with these expectations. I'm going to do things the way I feel like I can do it. Why are they making me do this? I'm tired. It's a hard service. It says, are not our days like those of hired laborers? So Job is talking about just that lamenting feeling of exhaustion, being ran down, having challenge after challenge after challenge after challenge, worn out. And we know that burnout is real. Sometimes people make the worst decisions because they're just tired. And so we, when I think about when I'm sitting in that decision, what's happening with that individual? Are they just tired? They're lamenting. And so we've decided, okay, you know what? We've done everything we can do. We're going to go ahead and move forward. There's a couple of things that I try to establish when we're going forward with a separation, involuntary separation, might I add. And a couple of things that are hard to do is to know exactly when that should take place. So, there's so much study out there about what day of the week you should do a termination. Should you do it at the beginning of the week? Should you do it at the end of the week? In the middle of the week? Should you do it at the beginning of the workday? Should you do it at the end of the workday? But remember, what we're doing is we're looking at this individual. In every case, you have to do an individual assessment of what will work. Sometimes you don't have a whole lot of options. I've had to separate with people over the phone. I've had to do it via email. Please don't do it. Don't do it via email. But sometimes you don't have a lot of options, right? So each circumstance, you want to be thoughtful about what's happening with that individual. For example, you have an employee who rides 2 hours on a bus to come to work, and then they get there and you say, here's your paperwork. What? No. So we want to be thinking about all of those factors, right? Maybe you have an employee who has, young people or family that are depending on them in the workforce. So maybe that separation needs to happen at the end of the week so all of them can leave and lament together outside of the workforce. Worst things to happen is you got sister fired, other sister in the other place, calling everybody. The rumor mill starts to spin, and all day long and all week long, we're just talking about some things that we don't need to talk about. Maybe the decision is we'll do it at the end of the week so the whole family can lament together. And then sometimes you're thinking about what we want to expect from that employee when they're getting terminated. Some folks will stew in that space. They will be stuck there for a long period of time. How do we navigate that? Sometimes I've done terminations in a morning, and I have had a conversation with that employee and asked them, I want you to go and focus in on the fact that you're separate, but I want you to call me. And because I've done it earlier in the day or earlier in the week, they've had access to me to go through some of the questions, talk through some of the challenges, think through some of the processes a little bit. So you just really want to think about that individual and what will work best for them to make sure that you're doing that well, keeping their dignity intact, right? There's a couple of different pieces. It's kind of an orchestrated process, really, right? You want to make sure that where you do this conversation is safe. We want to provide safe spaces for people. I think especially in our faith, we believe in safety and caring for others, and this is no different. So I often thinking about a neutral conference room that's close to maybe an exit so that they can exit without having to walk through their peers' workspace and have to face all of those other folks after such a terrible experience they have had. So providing them a little bit of safety and privacy is helpful. When you're in that room, making sure that maybe even you are closest to the door and you're paying close attention to that individual and having that discussion with them. Keeping your distractions away, making sure you're not on the phone, they're not on the phone, that you're really able to engage in an intentional, specific conversation. I also prefer to be in a space where there's reduced staff walk-bys. So if you have a space that has low traffic, pick that location. Pick that location so that there's not a lot of people walking by, lurking in. Those types of moments, believe it or not, will agitate that person, will make that situation really terrible. And it didn't have to be that way. So a space and the where location that and then what's happening in that room are key to ensuring that that person is protected and cared for a little bit better. Then I think about who's in the room, right? Who's in the room when you're having that? And in my mind, I think about sometimes the person that has made the decision to terminate this employee is probably not always the best person to be in that room even. Why? Contentious relationship. If I see you, what do they say? On site. So I don't want to put anybody in danger either. Managers, sometimes if that relationship is already contentious, perhaps what I do is get the next level manager to come into that room instead of that manager. Always, always have two people in that space because you need somebody to, maybe there's somebody to help mitigate, keep that energy, that, agitation down, but also to witness any conversation that happens to make sure that everybody in there is protected. Remember, it's not an easy conversation. It really isn't. It's not an easy conversation, but you're going to have to do the tough stuff. I think about this, I tell you, I've been in HR as an HRD, 10 years. And I probably have done over 100 terminations. And at least 60, 70 of those were at a clinic when I was a first-time HRD. I have had some conversations. I've been cussed out, yelled at, threatened. I've had somebody, show me their piece. I was able to manage that circumstance. But that's when I was learning, right? And so as time has progressed, I've gotten smarter, better, more intentional about those discussions. I've had one termination, and I'll welcome you all to share some as well. Fast forward 2 years, I caught up with her. We went back to Kansas, and I caught up with her, and she says, "You know what? I'm so grateful that you let me go from that job. Now I have this great job at this location. My kids are doing really well. I can afford the things that I need to do to afford to be able to live according to my needs." And she said, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Sometimes we have to do the tough stuff, but God's love. So what do we say when we're in the room? We say when we're in the room, I don't know. Some people may say I'm a little bit long-winded, but in this moment, I'm probably the shortest I will ever be in a conversation. Simple, clear, concise. I'm not walking into the room, "Hey, how you doing?" That's mismatched expectations, right? You walk in, this is your last day. We walk through the paperwork, okay? You do not want to mismatch that expectations. The worst thing is you're being so joyful to somebody that you're getting ready to turn around and do something that could be very harmful. Careful there. So don't engage in back and forth. All of that discussion probably and should have happened early on. We've had conversations. We've done the coaching. We've had the performance improvement plan. We've gone through the paces. So in this room, there really is no need for back and forth. And oftentimes, it's not a surprise to them when they get into that room. If you have done the pre-work. Never give a future date. I don't know if anybody's ever done that, but if you have, that's just crazy. Don't do that. We're terminating you tomorrow. And so finish up your day, and then tomorrow, don't know. This is the moment. This is the second. This is the end. Clear, concise, right? Make sure that you collect information from them that might be needed if necessary. Sometimes I'm giving this packet and it has all of their benefits stuff. It has, what to do next with their benefits, but they're clouded by that emotion. And so that's why I tell them, hey, I'm going to give you this packet. It has all of my information. I want you to call me and let's walk through this information at a later time. It's unreasonable for us to expect somebody to make a decision about their employment when they've been hit with something like this at that moment. So give them that information and let them know to follow up with you. And you alone, likely. If it's not your HR, it's you, whomever is the benefits person or whomever is the best person to answer those post-employment questions. Of course, collect of the accessibility that they might have to the organization in that room. If they have a badge, collect the badge. If they have a computer and collect that. If it's a phone, get those things. And one of the things I do, I try to orchestrate ahead of time by ensuring that IT connection is closed off, because we've had those moments. I've made those errors where you terminated somebody. They still had Teams and Outlook on their phone, and boom, they send that message to all the company. You know what so-and-so did. We don't want that. We want to make sure that we create a space in which they're separated fully, completely, without any further contact with the organization in that way. Okay? Feels cold. But the difference there is that we've done all of that work ahead of time. And again, a lot of times they're not surprised. Listen, it's hard. You yourself are going to be in a state. I've been in spaces that's whack. It's a moment that not everybody should experience, has experienced, wants to experience, but it's an experience that is part of the work that I have to do. Take a deep breath, trust the Lord. I do a lot of praying, so pray before you go in there too. And trust that God has got you. And trust that if you believe that you have done everything that you can do, if you believe that you have provided all the options that you can provide, then this moment is going to be okay. After it's all said and done, again, you should have created a plan. Create a plan. Be very intentional. Be very thoughtful. The communication plan that makes sure that the team that they are leaving, if they're leaving a team, the spaces that they're exiting, that they have what they need to move forward. Now, we know you can't really share personnel information, so you're not going to go and start telling this, that, and the other, all the reasons. So don't do that. But you can say this employee is no longer on the team, and this is who you will go to for this particular need, this particular request, question, what have you. Make sure that you have a plan that has been thought through with the managers, with your leaders, your executive leadership, if it comes to that level. Make sure that you have communicated that plan with that leadership team. Make sure that you have that happen right after that separation. Don't wait. Don't let it stew. Don't do a separation and then hope that, you'll figure it out. No, know exactly, respond right away, communicate that transition as quickly as you can. And then, of course, make sure that those records are clear. Make sure that those personnel items are protected. Make sure that you are thoughtful about that employee. It's a lot. It can be heavy, but it's the work that we do as we lead people. And sometimes it's got to be God, right? So when you're making a restructure decision, it's an organizational decision to end employment for a large swath of people. I've seen it done terribly, but I've also known that you're not necessarily going to get it perfect, right? There's no perfection in this because you're ending someone's livelihood, but there are better ways that we can do this. And one of the key pieces is that communication. I was with an organization where they gathered a group of folks, and I was in that group of like 40 of us in a room, and said they were laying off our section of the company. No communication prior to that. And just like you say, you were not allowed to gather your things. But then they learned from that. And what they did in the next round of layoffs is that they had a plan of folks that were able to escort people to provide them some time to gather their items. Because really, when you're talking about tenured people, they've collected things. They've collected things. And it's not their fault at that moment that they're being let go. That conversation in that discussion of this separation has got to be intentional there. Hey, this is not about your performance. It's about the finances, the structure, the what we're doing, because people want answers as to why. And when you don't provide that, that's what upticks that agitation. Not having clarity creates conflict. So I would say that there's going to be probably even more to come. There's some pieces that I've walked through that they could do better. That communication plan is so critical. And maybe it's something as simple as, here's the documentation of how we're going to allow you to get your stuff. You're going to follow person B and you'll get your items. And if you have extra things, we'll make arrangements to make sure that you can do that. I've been in organizations where when we did have different layoffs, they did it on a day in which the weekend where the customers weren't there, and that workforce could come and get their items and clear out their desks. So being thoughtful there is something that is an organization decision. We know that when you do those large layoffs, if you're doing it for a financial reason, it's still not going to sit well. So you just have to be thoughtful of how can you be creative about that experience that they have. And that would be the best that I could offer you in that circumstance. I still reflect back about the confusing messaging that folks were getting for the federal workers. You're gone, don't come in, you come back in, don't do this. You want to be clear. No clarity creates confusion. It's a good question, Chris. I haven't been in a situation where I've had to, yes, I have. Yeah, I think my max at one point was 10 in a day, and it was a little challenging. Again, this is novice HRD. If I were to do it differently, I could probably do the amount, but I would do it in a way in which there was some breakage, there was some time down, because it is an emotional pull, even on me, right? So I think there could be a breakage of how much you have to do in one, but I think it all depends on the circumstance, right? The reason I had to do those 10, I had they weren't called care teams. I had a unit that had serious violations, and that whole unit had to be turned over. And I couldn't do them, and I wouldn't do them all in a room, all 10 of you here. So 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. But yeah, I do pray. I spend quite a bit of time praying over even just the paperwork that I'm getting ready to provide, just thinking about that person and what they experience. And one of the things I try to be intentional is to look at them. I never want to have that kind of discussion with my head down or not facing them. You need to face them, look in their eyes, see their humanity, and be clear. Yeah. Culture fit, workforce fit are very delicate reasons for termination. So I really try to redirect managers to be very specific about what they are not doing with that fits within the culture, within the mission. Are they not responding to the patient in a timely manner? And our mission is to be highly responsive. That even can, because what we're saying is that not only are you not meeting our mission, you're not performing in that mission well. So you want to be still very clear and concise about what that means. Be careful about the fluidity of fit, because it slips quickly into discrimination, right? Quickly. So careful there. Be very intentional. If I'm not missional because I don't love Christ, I hired you and you don't love Christ, right? And that's part of our expectation. Then I drive them back to maybe there's a statement of faith. Here's our statement of faith. We've asked you to adhere to this statement of faith. In this statement of faith, it indicates that you have to confess Christ as your Lord and Savior. If that's part of your missional expectation, always drive them back to where the specifics are that they're not meeting. Because the worst thing is, and that's a good statement too, the decision has been made. If you have further concerns, here's the grievance process. Absolutely. Leverage that grievance process. Sometimes they don't care about that grievance. They just want to engage you in saying something, goad you into saying something that could be detrimental and that they can latch onto, that can go into a labor law discrimination, right? Or labor violation. Yeah. Use your grievance policy. If you have one, if you don't have one, absolutely create one. Make sure that folks have recourse. A lot of folks will just take the EEOC recourse anyway, which is fine and fair. But if you've done your work, don't be afraid of the EEOC coming in and asking you questions. Do your work. And that way those questions will be easy. But yes, no, I appreciate that. Limit that back and forth with this is where we're at. I always hope that people are true believers that are working. And being a believer doesn't mean that you're free from having emotions, the human experience. But we also want to hope that they are also praying, that they are also seeking God in this moment. At least we pray they are. I mean, that's what we should be doing. Good conversation. Thank you. Any other? Yeah. Hopefully you all do not have to be in this moment. That's the mistake sometimes we make. We say, well, you're doing really well in this area, you're doing really well in this area, but you didn't do well in this area, so we're firing you. And then that opens up a whole other door, mixed expectations. Probably why they said, just say this. And it really depends on the person. You have to be there. And some managers, some HR folks are not comfortable there. So they do need a script. They need to be able to stick to something that's really intentional, that's really short and specific. But if you have the ability to build relationship with your workforce and you have the ability to hopefully establish their understanding of you as manager or leader, that when it does come to that moment, there's at least some trust and belief that you are not doing this maliciously and that the decision was made with lots of thought. Yeah. Go ahead, Tia. Yeah. Yeah. It's always an interesting experience, especially when you're dealing with someone who is highly emotional, volatile. There's nothing that you can say to somebody in that emotional state that's going to make them feel better. I've tried it. There's really nothing that you can say. And so one of the things I do try to do is just look at them. Seeing them and allowing them to share, allowing them to pour out what they're experiencing. And there's been times, because I've had a deeper understanding of them or a relationship, I will say, I can understand why you would feel that way. I'm sorry you feel that way. Just letting them know that you hear them, that you receive that emotional plight that they're in, and acknowledging that. It doesn't mean that you disagree with the action that you're taking. You're acknowledging that feeling that they're feeling in that moment. And sometimes people just want to express that feeling. They just want somebody to dump on. That's okay. I'll be the dumper. Yeah. Woo, Jesus. I have a regular monthly massage appointment. And I really do. I do believe in bathing those moments in prayer prior to. I love people. I'm a lover of people, and so it grieves me when I know that they are hurting, but it also gives me comfort to know that God has got them and that there's some things that only the Lord can take on. And so I believe that for every individual, even if they don't believe it for themselves, I believe it for them. If you all are struggling with something and you would like some intentional guidance, we can walk through a case together. I'm happy to do that with you. I'll provide my information. You can reach out. And if you're going through something, you just kind of want to walk through, what should I do? Maybe you're looking to create your own grievance process. And you haven't established that yet. I'd love to help you do that. Maybe you're thinking about, how do I fix a situation that I'm in? I'm happy to help you do that as well. But trust that the Lord is with you. He won't forsake you. And even in the difficulty, you'll be all right.